The Battle of Gaugamela was the decisive confrontation between Alexander the Great and Darius III of Persia, and it basically ended the Persian Empire as a meaningful political entity. This was the third and final major battle between these two rulers, and it was the one where Alexander basically said, "Okay, I'm done playing around, let's finish this." I'm not going to explain the entire history of Alexander's conquest of Persia, because if I started down that road, we'd be here all day, and I'd never actually get to the battle itself. Alexander wanted to conquer Persia, Darius wanted to stop him from conquering Persia. You can look up the details if you want more context than that. So the Battle of Gaugamela was the culmination of years of campaigning by Alexander in Persian territory. There had already been two previous major battles. The first was at the Granicus River, where Alexander had defeated a Persian force and secured his foothold in Asia Minor. The second was at Issus, where he had faced Darius directly for the first time and sent him running. But Darius had escaped, and the Persian Empire, while wounded, was still very much alive. After Issus, Alexander spent a couple of years consolidating his control over the eastern Mediterranean. He conquered the Phoenician cities, he took Egypt. He basically secured his supply lines and his rear before pushing deeper into Persian territory. Darius, meanwhile, had been busy too. He'd been raising a new army, and this time he was going to do it right. By 331 BCE, Alexander was ready to march into the heart of the Persian Empire. He crossed the Euphrates River, then the Tigris, pushing deep into Mesopotamia. Darius had been waiting for him. He'd chosen his battlefield carefully near the town of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. And when I say he chose his battlefield carefully, I mean he really went all out. He had the ground leveled and smoothed to make it perfect for his chariots and cavalry. He basically turned this place into a custom-built killing field, designed specifically to destroy Alexander's army. The two armies met in early October of 331 BCE. Let's talk about what each side brought to the fight, because the numbers are kind of insane. Darius had assembled an absolutely massive army. Ancient sources give wildly different numbers, ranging from a conservative 100,000 to over 1,000,000 men. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. Modern historians generally agree that Darius probably had around 100,000 to 120,000 men. This included cavalry from all over the empire, infantry from dozens of different regions, 200 scythe chariots, and 15 war elephants. The Persians had cavalry from Bactria, from Scythia, from everywhere. They had the best horsemen in the known world, and they had a lot of them. Estimates put the Persian cavalry at around 30,000 to 40,000 men. The rest were infantry of varying quality. Alexander, on the other hand, had about 47,000 men total. 7,000 of them were cavalry and 40,000 were infantry. His army was much smaller, but it was also much more professional. These were hardened veterans who had been campaigning with him for years. His companion cavalry were among the finest heavy cavalry in the ancient world. His Macedonian phalanx was a revolutionary formation that had proven itself time and time again. And his hypaspists, an elite infantry unit, were basically the special forces of their day. So yeah, Alexander was outnumbered, badly, probably somewhere between 2 to 1 and 3 to 1 depending on whose numbers you believe. But he'd been outnumbered before and it hadn't stopped him yet. When Alexander arrived and saw the battlefield Darius had prepared, he did what any sensible commander would do. He stopped and thought about it. His generals urged him to attack at night to negate the Persian numerical advantage and maybe cause some chaos in their ranks. Alexander refused. He supposedly said something like, "I will not steal my victory," which sounds cool and noble, but was also probably pretty smart. A night attack against an army that size in unfamiliar territory could easily turn into a disaster. Instead, Alexander spent the time before the battle doing reconnaissance. He rode around the Persian positions, studying their deployment, looking for weaknesses. He noticed that Darius had extended his line to prevent being outflanked. The Persian line was stretched thin in places, trying to match the width of the prepared battlefield. This gave Alexander an idea. The night before the battle, Alexander's men rested while the Persians stood to arms, expecting a night attack that never came. This was already a psychological victory for Alexander. His men would be fresh for the battle, while the Persians would be exhausted from standing around all night in full armor. As dawn broke on October 1st, 331 BCE, both armies began to deploy. Let me walk you through how they set up, because the deployment itself was crucial to how the battle unfolded. Darius placed himself in the center of his line, as was traditional for Persian kings. He was surrounded by his best infantry and his royal cavalry. On his left wing he placed Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, with a massive force of Bactrian and Scythian cavalry. On his right wing he placed Mazius with cavalry from Syria and Mesopotamia. The scythe chariots were distributed along the front of his line, with the elephants held in reserve. The Persian line was enormous, stretching for miles across the plain. Alexander deployed his army in a much more compact formation. He placed his companion cavalry on the right wing with himself at their head. The Macedonian phalanx held the center with the hypaspis linking the phalanx to the cavalry. On the left wing he placed Parmenion, his second-in-command, with the Thessalian cavalry and some allied units. But here's where it gets interesting. Alexander didn't just deploy in a simple line. He created a second line behind his first, angled back at 45 degrees on both flanks. This created a formation that looked kind of like a giant arrow pointing at the Persian center. More importantly, it meant that if the Persians tried to outflank him, they'd run into his second line. He also held back a reserve, something the Persians hadn't bothered with. As the two armies faced each other across the plain, you have to imagine what this must have looked like. The Persian line stretching as far as the eye could see, a sea of different colored uniforms and banners from all across the empire. The Macedonian line, smaller but tighter, more disciplined, the sun glinting off their sarissas, those 18-foot-long pikes that were the signature weapon of the phalanx. The battle began with Darius sending his scythe chariots forward. These things were terrifying weapons, basically ancient tanks with blades sticking out of the wheels and the yoke, designed to crash into infantry formations and tear them apart. Darius had been saving them for a moment like this, and he unleashed all 200 of them at once. But Alexander had fought against chariots before, and he knew how to deal with them. As the chariots thundered forward, the Macedonian infantry did something unexpected. They opened lanes in their formation. The chariots, unable to change direction, rolled harmlessly through the gaps. The few that actually hit the Macedonian lines were dealt with by soldiers using javelins and by the sheer discipline of the phalanx. Some of the charioteers were pulled from their vehicles and killed. Others made it through the lines only to be captured by troops in the rear. The great chariot charge, which was supposed to break the Macedonian center, had accomplished basically nothing. While this was happening, Alexander was already putting his plan into motion. Instead of advancing straight forward, he began moving his entire army to the right at an angle. This was a risky move because it exposed his flank, but Alexander was counting on the Persians doing exactly what they did next. Bessus on the Persian left saw the Macedonians moving right and panicked. He thought Alexander was trying to get off the prepared ground where the terrain might favor the Macedonians. He ordered his cavalry forward to intercept them. This was exactly what Alexander wanted. As the Bactrian and Scythian cavalry charged forward, Alexander sent his light cavalry and some infantry to meet them. But he held back his companions, his best troops. On the other side of the field, Mazius on the Persian right wing also attacked, engaging with Parmenion's forces on the Macedonian left. This was turning into a massive cavalry battle on both flanks, with thousands of horsemen crashing into each other. And here's where Alexander's genius really shows. As Bessus's cavalry charged forward to stop the Macedonian right from moving off the prepared ground, they created a gap in the Persian line. The Persian center, where Darius was positioned, had been stretched thin to begin with. Now, with Bessus's forces pulled forward and to the right, there was a hole opening up between the Persian left and the Persian center. Alexander saw it immediately. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He wheeled his companion cavalry around and charged directly at the gap. The hypaspists and part of the phalanx wheeled with him, creating a massive wedge formation that punched into the Persian line. The companions crashed into the Persian center at an angle, hitting them in the flank. The Persian infantry there, who had been expecting to face the Macedonian phalanx head-on, suddenly found themselves being attacked from the side by the finest heavy cavalry in the world, led by Alexander himself. They broke almost immediately. Alexander drove deeper into the Persian line, heading straight for Darius. The Persian king, from his position on his chariot, could see Alexander coming. He could see his guards being cut down, could see the Macedonians getting closer and closer. And Darius did what he'd done at Issus. He ran. Now, I don't want to be too hard on Darius here. The guy was a king, not really a soldier. He'd been placed on the throne by a court official after the previous king was murdered, and he'd never really been trained for this kind of thing. He was brave enough to show up to the battle, which is more than some kings would have done. But when it came down to it, when he saw Alexander cutting his way toward him, he decided that discretion was the better part of valor and got the hell out of there. The problem was, when the king runs, everyone notices. The Persian center began to collapse. Units that had been holding their ground suddenly saw their king fleeing and decided they should probably flee too. The Persian right and left wings were still fighting, still holding their own, but the center was falling apart. But the battle wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. While Alexander was busy chasing Darius, things were getting complicated elsewhere on the battlefield. Remember how the Persian line was so long and stretched out? Well, some Persian and Indian cavalry from the center had found a gap in the Macedonian line. While Alexander was charging forward with the companions, they'd managed to get through and were now behind the Macedonian lines. They rode straight for the Macedonian camp, where they started looting and causing chaos. Meanwhile, on the Macedonian left, Parmenion was in serious trouble. Mazius had committed everything he had, and the Thessalian cavalry was being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Parmenion sent a messenger to Alexander, basically saying, "Hey, I could really use some help over here." Alexander was faced with a choice. He was chasing Darius, he was on the verge of ending the battle and possibly the war. But his left flank was collapsing, and if Mazius broke through completely, the entire Macedonian army could be surrounded and destroyed. Alexander made the hard choice. He turned back, he gathered the companions and rode to help Parmenion. On the way, he ran into the Persian cavalry that had broken through to the Macedonian rear. This turned into one of the most vicious cavalry melees of the entire battle. The Persians were trying to get back to their own lines with their loot. Alexander was trying to stop them and get to Parmenion. It was a confused, brutal fight, and Alexander lost more men here than in any other part of the battle. Eventually, Alexander cut his way through and reached the left flank. The companions crashed into Mazius's forces from behind. This was too much for the Persians. They'd been fighting hard, they'd been winning, but now they were being attacked from two directions and their king had fled. They began to retreat. With both flanks of the Persian army now collapsing and the center already gone, the battle turned into a rout. The Persian army, which had been so impressive just hours before, was now a panicked mob trying to escape. The Macedonians pursued them for miles, cutting down anyone they could catch. Darius, meanwhile, was long gone. He'd fled east with what remained of his guard, heading for the interior of his empire. Alexander wanted to pursue him immediately, but his army was exhausted. They'd been fighting for hours and they needed rest. The pursuit of Darius would have to wait. Let's talk about casualties because they're pretty staggering. Ancient sources claim the Persians lost anywhere from 40,000 to 90,000 men. Modern historians think the real number was probably around 30,000 to 40,000, which is still massive. The Macedonians lost somewhere between 300 and 1,000 men, depending on which source you believe. Even if we take the high estimate, that's an absolutely lopsided victory. But the real significance of Gaugamela wasn't just the casualties. It was what the battle represented. Darius had gathered the largest army he could possibly raise. He'd chosen the battlefield. He'd had every advantage except the quality of his troops and his commanders, and he'd been utterly defeated. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire essentially ceased to exist as a unified state. Darius fled east and was eventually murdered by his own satraps. Alexander marched into Babylon, which opened its gates to him without a fight. He took Susa, then Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia. He spent the next several years conquering the eastern provinces of the empire, but there was no organized resistance anymore. It was just mopping up. What I want you to take away from this battle is how Alexander used his enemy's strengths against them. Darius had numbers, so Alexander made those numbers work against him by stretching out the Persian line. Darius had chosen the battlefield, so Alexander used the smooth ground to his advantage, moving his army quickly and precisely. Darius had his cavalry, so Alexander drew them out of position with a feint, then exploited the gap they left behind. Look at how Alexander set up his army with that angled second line. He was already planning for what would happen when the Persians tried to outflank him. Look at how he held back a reserve, something that seems obvious to us now but wasn't common practice at the time. Look at how he personally led the decisive charge, but also knew when to turn back and help his struggling left flank. The battle also shows you the importance of combined arms warfare. Alexander didn't just rely on his cavalry or his infantry, he used them together. The companions punched through the Persian line, but it was the hypaspists and the phalanx that secured the breakthrough and prevented the Persians from closing the gap. The light cavalry screened his movements and drew out the Persian cavalry. Every part of his army had a role to play. And let's talk about that moment when Alexander had to choose between pursuing Darius and helping Parmenion. That's the kind of decision that wins or loses battles. If he kept chasing Darius, he might have caught him, but he also might have lost his entire army. If he'd been too cautious and turned back too early, Darius might have escaped anyway and the Persian center might have rallied. Alexander made the right call at the right time, which is basically the definition of good generalship. One more thing I want to point out is how Alexander used psychological warfare. By refusing to attack at night, he made the Persians stand to arms all night, exhausting them before the battle even started. By personally leading the charge at the Persian center, he created panic and drew attention to himself, which made Darius's flight even more demoralizing to the Persian troops. By creating that wedge formation and driving straight at Darius, he turned the battle into a personal confrontation, king versus king, and when Darius blinked first, the entire Persian army knew it. Gaugamela was the culmination of everything Alexander had learned in his career. He'd been studying warfare since he was a kid under Aristotle. He'd been commanding troops since he was a teenager. He'd fought at Chaeronea alongside his father Philip. He'd conquered Thrace and Illyria. He'd crossed into Asia and won at Granicus and Issus. Every lesson he'd learned, every tactic he'd mastered, every bit of experience he'd gained, it all came together at Gaugamela. And the crazy thing is, Alexander was only 25 years old when this battle happened. 25. Most people at 25 are still trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives. Alexander had conquered the largest empire in the world. After Gaugamela, Alexander would go on to push even further east. He'd cross into India, fight more battles, conquer more territory. But Gaugamela was the battle that broke the Persian Empire. Everything after that was just details. The battle also changed the course of world history in ways that are hard to overstate. The Persian Empire had been the dominant power in the Near East for over 2 centuries. It had stretched from Egypt to India, from the Black Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. It had been the enemy that united the Greek city-states, the great other that defined what it meant to be Greek, and Alexander destroyed it in an afternoon. In its place, Alexander created a new empire, one that blended Greek and Persian culture, that spread Greek language and ideas across Asia. This Hellenistic world would last for centuries, influencing everything from art to science to philosophy. The cities Alexander founded, like Alexandria in Egypt, would become centers of learning and culture. The Greek language would become the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, which is why the New Testament was written in Greek centuries later. None of that happens without Gaugamela. If Darius had won, or even if the battle had been inconclusive, Alexander's invasion would have stalled. He was far from home at the end of a long supply line in hostile territory. A defeat at Gaugamela would probably have meant the end of his campaign, maybe even the end of his life. But he didn't lose. He won decisively against an enemy that outnumbered him by at least 2 to 1, possibly 3 to 1. He won because he was a better general than Darius, because his army was better trained, because he understood how to use terrain and timing and psychology to his advantage. Gaugamela is studied in military academies to this day, and for good reason. It's a masterclass in how to win a battle against superior numbers. It's a lesson in the importance of reconnaissance, of planning, of flexibility, of knowing when to commit your reserves and when to hold them back. It's a demonstration of how a smaller, more professional army can defeat a larger, less organized one. So yeah, the Battle of Gaugamela. Alexander versus Darius, round 3 and final. 47,000 Macedonians versus over 100,000 Persians. And when the dust settled, the Persian Empire was finished and Alexander was the new master of Asia. Not bad for a day's work. During the next few years, Alexander would continue his conquests, pushing into Central Asia and India, but he would never fight another battle quite like Gaugamela. Stay tuned for those stories. Like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.